Thank you all again for being here. As Mr. Close said, my name is Kevin, and today's presentation is called Growing Up with the ADA. And just by a quick show of hands really quickly here, how many of you are familiar with what the ADA is? Just a quick show of hands. Okay, not a lot, that's okay. That's why I put in this first slide here. So we're gonna start off with what is the ADA. So the ADA is known as the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it was signed on July 26th of 1990, before all of you were born, and even before I was born. I was actually born 8 months after it was passed. And the ADA is significant because it is one of the largest pieces of civil rights legislation in United States history. This law made it possible for me to attend public schools, to get the accommodations I needed. And honestly, I may not be having this speech in front of you here today if it was not for this law. The law was signed by President George H.W. Bush. If you're not familiar, that is the older one. And that was signed here in the Rose Garden of the White House. This law is what most people with disabilities would refer to as almost our version of a Bill of Rights, because it provided us protections against discrimination and provided us access to public accommodations. And you might be asking, what is a public accommodation? Well, you're sitting in one right now. This school is a public accommodation, a hospital, pretty much anything that isn't a private residence qualifies as a public accommodation. And this law makes it possible for me to have access to whatever business or organization, school that I need to access by reducing those physical barriers. And then in 2008, this law was actually amended by President George W. Bush, the son of President George H.W. Bush, where they broadened the definition of disability. So you're probably wondering, who is this guy on stage in front of you that's talking to you right now? So I am local to the area. I grew up in Buffalo Grove, literally just down the street here on Deerfield Parkway. I actually grew up at the west end of Deerfield Parkway, where it intersects with Route 83. So pretty close, about 10, 15 minutes from here. I went to Stevenson High School, which you all may be familiar with. And then I later attended Illinois State University, where I got a degree in mass media radio. My goal at one point in my life was to be the next voice of the Chicago Cubs. And while I am still a diehard Cubs fan and sports fan in general, that mission has changed a little bit. And now I do this. I go into different schools, businesses, organizations, whoever will have me, and share some of my life experiences living with a physical disability. And at this point, you're probably wondering, well, why am I in the wheelchair? What is my condition? It is a condition known as arthrogryposis multiplex congenita, or AMC. What AMC is, I'll get to it a little bit more on the next slide, is essentially my muscles are more fibrous than the average person's. I am able to walk with the assistance of what are called AFOs. They're also known as leg braces. You can't see them because they're underneath my pants. And obviously I use this power wheelchair for longer distances as well. I am the only person in my family who has arthrogryposis. I have two siblings, both older, and they are both completely able-bodied, as are my parents, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, everyone. Everyone in my family is physically able-bodied except for me. In my career, since graduating college, I've worked in a few different industries. I worked for a radio show for a year. It was based out of Los Angeles right after college. And then I went into insurance for a little while. And then my most recent jobs have been in freight, so shipping basically, and tech. So my most recent job was with a tech company. And now I do this mainly. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. So arthrogryposis multiplex congenita, or AMC, I'm willing to bet most of you have never heard of it before this speech, which is totally fine. It is considered a rare disease. It affects 1 in 3,000 live births. which is considered rare. I would not say it's super rare. There are definitely conditions out there that have far greater odds than arthrogryposis. As I mentioned, it causes fibrous tissue in my muscles and general contractures in both my arms and legs. I've had a number of surgeries in order to put my arms and legs at better angles and to try to increase strength and to improve my quality of life. Luckily, those surgeries have been pretty successful. I would say they all solved something in one way, shape, or form. The nice thing about arthrogryposis multiplex congenita is it is not a degenerative condition, which means it doesn't get worse over time, and it does not affect my critical organs. It doesn't affect my brain, my heart, my lungs, any of that. It only affects my muscles and my bones. So that's a little bit about AMC. And these are some of the symptoms of it. This third bullet point, if you read those, I am basically a textbook case. Internal rotation of the shoulders. I was born with a dislocated hip, which you'll get to see on the next slide here. You'll see what that looked like. And I also was born with club feet, which were corrected pretty shortly after I was born. That was one of the first surgeries that I had. And what club feet is, it means that my toes were curling under my foot, so that those needed to be straightened in order for me to walk. So now we're gonna kind of take a walk through my life here, starting with the early childhood to 8th grade era. When I was born, as I mentioned, there were a lot of different things that needed to be corrected. The first 5 years of my life, I had about 6 to 8 surgeries, I would say. Some of them were very minor, and some of them were more major. I had to have the dislocated hip fixed. I had to have the club foot fixed. I had a surgery at one point where my doctor actually tried to make me a lefty. He had a theory that my left arm could potentially be stronger than my right arm. And while that isn't exactly the case, I am a righty. I do type with my left hand. So I consider a surgery like that to be a, quote, successful failure. It didn't achieve the ultimate mission, but it did improve my daily living and my quality of life. During this time, I had to start school, which was certainly an experience. I remember on my very first day of kindergarten all those years ago, I got out of my wheelchair and I went to walk around the room and I tripped on a chair and fell. So pretty early on, I knew that things were going to be a little different for me. I had a one-on-one aide every year that I was in school. And at this time, for most of this time, through about 6th grade, I used a manual wheelchair, which meant that I had a lot less independence than I do currently. That is the nice thing about having a power wheelchair, is that I can go where I want, when I want. And that is a level of independence that honestly would have been impossible just 30, 40, 50 years ago, probably. So I was very lucky in that regard, that I was born when I was, and that I grew up in an era where assistive technology took massive leaps forward. And we'll get to more of that in a second here. As you can see by this middle photo, I did play in a baseball league for people with disabilities. It is located in Buffalo Grove. It's through what's called the BGRA, Buffalo Grove Recreation Association, and it's known as Buddy Baseball. And essentially what Buddy Baseball is it pairs players with disabilities with able-bodied buddies who are responsible for helping with fielding, running the bases, hitting, everything involved in a baseball game. If any of you are looking for volunteer opportunities, I highly recommend it. They're always looking for volunteers, and it's not that far from here, which is nice. And it's also cool because they play their games on a rubber baseball field. It's the same material that you see a lot of playgrounds made out of these days, that rubber flooring. And then this picture on the right here, these are my siblings. I am the youngest of 3. My siblings are named Aaron and Matt, and again, like I mentioned, they are able-bodied. And that was a really great experience for me, having two older siblings who were able-bodied, because they got to do everything first. I got to learn from them, both their mistakes and their accomplishments. Going to a school like Stevenson, for instance, which is huge, that was made a lot easier by having two older siblings who had already done it. And I knew what to expect, luckily. So they kind of softened the blow for me, so to speak. I love them dearly. They have always treated me like they would treat everybody else. As you can see in this photo, they're kind of piled on top of me. But yeah, they're great. They're super helpful, and I'm very lucky to have grown up with them and for them to have experienced these things before I did. And then in 6th grade, I went to middle school when I was about your guys' age, Twin Groves Middle School in Buffalo Grove. And that was a big transition as well, because at least in my school district, in elementary school, you were with one teacher the whole day. But when you get to middle school, you switch rooms throughout the day. You go to different rooms for different subjects. And that created a whole new layer of figuring out what accommodations I needed. So when I was in middle school, I would actually park my wheelchair outside of the classroom, and then I would get up and I would go in and sit on a bench that was, I guess you can call it an assistive bench technically, because it was manufactured by like an assistive technology company. And I had, I want to say 3 or 4 of them, and they were spaced throughout the school. So depending on where my classes were, we would move the bench from one class to the other. If I had a class that was right next door, we would just move it. Sometimes we would store it in like the stairwell or wherever we could find space. So that was a layer of accommodation that we had to figure out. And this was also about the time where I got my first power wheelchair, which was good timing since I would be moving classes a lot and have to be a lot more mobile throughout the day. My first wheelchair, which went bye-bye a long time ago, was life-changing. And it's funny because initially, I didn't want it. They suggested it, and I was a very stubborn child. And I was like, no, I don't want that. I want it to stay the way it's always been. And then once I got one and I got to experience being able to move on my own, I realized how important this would be and just how much easier it would be to be social, right? And make friends and be able to hang out with my friends without, my parents or another adult there to assist me. And obviously, when you're this age, that's important, right? You want to be able to hang out with your friends. You want to be able to have a good time. So the wheelchair was really life-changing, and this era definitely helped get me ready for a very large transition, which would be coming up next in the form of high school. So now we get to high school. I know a lot of you may be familiar with Stevenson. It is a very, very large school. My graduating class was over 1,100 students, and it was arguably the toughest transition that I had in my childhood. I remember getting there, and I had friends. I knew people from middle school who, obviously were still there, but it was different. Our schedules were all different. Our lunch periods weren't based on which grade we were in anymore, so you could be with anyone. And that was a tough transition. At the beginning of freshman year, I remember I ate lunch with some friends that I had made previously in middle school. And then, slowly but surely, they started making friends and meeting new people. And they started sitting at other lunch tables. And then there was a point about a month into the school year where I was out for a few days due to a death in my family. And when I came back, I remember I went to the lunch table that day and nobody was there. So a friend of mine came up to me and he was like, hey, you want to eat over here? That's totally fine. I'm like, okay, great. So I pack up my lunch, I go over there and I start eating. and the people he was sitting with comes back from getting their lunch from the hot lunch line, and they look at me and they go, "What are you doing here?" And I'm just like, eating my lunch, minding my own business. And they look at me and they're like, "You can't sit here." And I go, "Why?" And they say, "We just don't want you to sit here." They couldn't give me a good reason, right? And at this point, I was like, well, my lunch is already unpacked. I'm already eating, so I'm not leaving. So at that point, they grabbed their lunches, they grabbed their bags, and they got up and they walked away. And I will say that in that moment, I felt so small and so insignificant, right? I went home that day and I cried my eyes out to my parents because I thought I was in for a brutal next 4 years of just trying to fit in. Luckily, at this time, my older brother Matt, was a senior when I was a freshman. So he was at the school at the time. Unfortunately, we also had different lunch periods. So it's not like I could even sit with him and his friends. However, he did have some friends who had the same lunch period as me. So for my first semester of high school, as a freshman, I sat with a bunch of seniors because they were the only ones who would willingly let me sit with them and not make a big deal about it. Luckily, as time went on, I met new people, I made new friends, and I was eventually able to, find people my age to sit with. But this was a recurring theme throughout high school. Pretty much every year of high school, except for my senior year, I had trouble finding somewhere to eat at lunch, which sounds so trivial to me now in my 30s, because that's something that adults just don't care about. But at the time, it was a huge deal. I thought, oh my God, I'm gonna be an outcast. No one's gonna like me. I'm not gonna make any friends. This is gonna be the longest 4 years of my life. And I had to make some adjustments in order to change that trajectory. My sophomore year, I joined a unaffiliated organization to the school, a youth group called BBYO. It's also known as B'nai B'rith Youth Organization. That's actually where I met Mr. Clow. And that was really what made high school a lot better for me, was getting involved and being able to meet those new people in a setting where that's kind of already the goal of it, right? To expand your network and to broaden your horizons, so to speak. BBYO was great because it taught me a lot about interacting with people, and I was able to get elected to a position on the board in my chapter, and it really prepared me well for what was to come later on in college. They had different conventions and different events. That's actually what this middle picture is from. This one was a competition between the chapters where they had different categories of you had to do a dance and a song and other things. But this was one of the best times in my life. And I really appreciate everything that it did for me. And in addition to BBYO, I also got involved with the student-run radio station that Stevenson had at the time. They no longer have one, unfortunately. But I knew I wanted to get into radio in college, or at least major in it. So this gave me some real-world hands-on experience. And I got to be involved with broadcasting football, basketball, and baseball. I worked the studio, got to do the pre, halftime, and post-game shows with some other coworkers, and it was awesome. Being on the radio finally was a dream come true, and it was great experience for later on in college. And then I just quickly want to touch on the guy in the left photo. He was my aide in high school. His name is Mr. Flood. He was my aide junior and senior year. And I do have to say, when he took over, that's definitely when things started to improve. Him and I just meshed well. We meshed really well. He's only 7 years older than me, so that was a lot easier walking around high school with someone who could kind of relate to what I was dealing with. And he also was a Stevenson alum himself. So he knew exactly what I was dealing with because he had gone to the same school at a certain point. He is a great friend of mine. We still keep in touch to this day. I actually stood up in his wedding about 12 years ago now. Yeah, so it was a great relationship. He followed me all day, every day for 2 years. Tried to chase me around the halls when I was going a little too quick. But yeah, he definitely helped make high school a lot better. And then after high school, we get to college. And as I mentioned before, I went to Illinois State University. This was, again, another difficult transition because for the first time in my life, my parents were not there. And up to this point, they were my primary caregivers. They had to do everything from showering me to getting me dressed to preparing my meals to doing my laundry. They had to do it all. And then suddenly, I'm at college now, and I had to figure out, okay, who's going to be helping me? So I go down to orientation before freshman year, and I meet with what's called the Student Access and Accommodation Services Office. And that's where you can get different accommodations like extra time on tests, things of that nature, if you have a disability. And they told me everything I could get, extended time, note takers, things of that nature. And in the next breath, they were like, for the personal assistance, that's all on you. You got to find them yourself, and we're not going to help with that. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm 18 years old. I just graduated high school. I've never had a job. And at that point in my life, I had never even interviewed for a job. And now I have to hire a whole group of people and manage them, schedule them, make sure they're paid on time, all of that. So that was a huge learning curve for me. Luckily, it was relatively easy to find people. The two things that ISU is known for in terms of majors is special education and nursing. So those were the two majors that I targeted the most. And luckily, they were accommodating and they were willing to let me post on the school's job board. So I did that going into freshman year and sophomore year, and thankfully, it was incredibly successful. Each time, I'd say I got about 40 to 50 applicants. And then from that, I whittled it down to a group of anywhere between 5 to 8 caregivers who would have various schedules and would come in at certain times. Freshman year at ISU was a bit of a challenge. I won't deny that. Again, I'm managing caregivers for the first time, and I knew some people, but I didn't know a lot of people. It took me a little while to get involved. In freshman year, I didn't join any clubs. I hadn't done anything. And I think that had an effect on how that year went. So when I got to sophomore year, I decided to join a fraternity, Alpha Epsilon Pi. The opportunity came up to be a founding father, which I had never imagined. I didn't ever even envision myself joining a fraternity. And then I got a random phone call one day asking me if I wanted to start one. And I was like, yeah, sure, let's do it. So I started a fraternity my sophomore year with about 19 other guys. And starting one from scratch is a huge learning experience as well, because you really have nothing to go off of. They tell you what to do and you're like, okay, we'll try it and we'll see what works. So within 2 weeks of this meeting, I am in the fraternity, and it was a good opportunity to meet people who had similar interests to me, came from the same area as me, and also just a good way to branch out and expand my network. Eventually, I would go on to hold some leadership positions in the fraternity. I was secretary and then vice president and then eventually president my last year of college. And that was something that I truly never envisioned happening. like I said, I didn't even plan on joining fraternity, let alone leading one. But when opportunities come up that seem like they could be worthy of taking, you got to take them. And ISU taught me a lot about how to live on my own, how to manage my life, and that is the unofficial degree that I feel like I got from my 5 years there. I technically have a degree in mass media radio, but I think the other unofficial degree that I got was just how to manage my life as a disabled person. And the lessons that I learned there are lessons that I still use to this day. So then after 5 years of college, I graduated with that degree, and we moved on to adulthood, where I entered the workforce. This was one of those transitions where I truly didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if it was going to be easy, hard. I didn't necessarily know all of the things that I would have to encounter. So for the first year out of college, I interned for a radio show based out of Los Angeles, and I was actually a remote employee. So I worked from home completely. And the cool thing was my boss at the time was legally blind. So she had a disability herself. She had a condition known as retinitis pigmentosa, which means that her vision gradually got worse over time. And when I helped her, she couldn't really see at all. So I would assist her with things like answering her emails and taking phone calls and things of that nature. And I would also do things that a usual intern would do, like help develop show ideas and organize callers. After about a year of doing that, I decided to move on to the insurance world, where I did that for a couple years. I pretty much got into that because my mom was in insurance, and she recommended that I got my insurance license because finding a job for me was a bit difficult. It has to be the right circumstance. Is it a job that I can do? Is it a job that I can get to easily? Is it something that I could grow in and ideally move up? So my mom worked for an insurance agent in Buffalo Grove. So for 2 years, I worked there part-time, assisting the agent and her. And I would only go in from like 10 to 2 in the middle of the day. My dad would drive me there and pick me up, or I would just ride there because the office was very close to my house. Proximity is key when you have a disability. The closer something is, the easier it is. And after 2 years of doing that and working in the same office as my mom, I decided that I wanted to branch out a little bit more and try something else. So that's when I decided to get into logistics. And that was a wild ride because for the first time, I would be commuting on public transportation in order to get to where I needed to be. So my office was in River North, which, if you look at a map of Chicago, it's just north of the river, about a mile. So I would take the Metra from Buffalo Grove to Union Station, and then I would either ride the last mile to my office in my wheelchair, or I would take a shuttle bus. And this presented some challenges. One, the lift on the train had to be working. And 2, the conductors had to see me, which can be a challenge at times. 3, my wheelchair had to be working, especially on the very, very cold days, because I commuted 5 days a week at this point. Some of the other problems that we had to deal with were the shuttle bus getting me from Union Station to my office. When I started this job, they went through a bus company that used pretty much old city buses, and they weren't exactly in the greatest shape. So sometimes the bus would pull up and I'd be sitting there and the driver would look at me and be like, yeah, the lift isn't working. Be like, okay, great. So it's freezing outside and now I have to wait out here even longer for another bus. Eventually, thankfully, the building that I worked in decided to switch bus providers, and the new bus provider had brand new buses with brand new wheelchair lifts, and that made things significantly easier and a lot less problems. So that was a good thing when that happened. When I started working in an office, I also had to figure out things like, who's going to help me? Like, I can't go a full 8 hours with nobody helping me, right? At some point, I got to eat lunch. I got to use the bathroom. So what do you do when you have a physical disability and you have to figure these things out? I hired an aide. He would come in for 3 hours a day. He would help me use the bathroom. He would feed me lunch, and then he would leave. And luckily, I also had some really good coworkers, some friends who worked there, who, in an emergency, were also willing to help me as needed. And that made things a lot easier. And then after 4 years of working that job, I got a new job where I was fully remote. And that was amazing. It made working a lot easier because cutting out that commute makes a huge difference. But in this job, I had to deal with traveling for work for the first time. So I had to figure out, okay, what kind of accommodations do I need? How do I request them? And how do I get my company to understand that there's going to be a little bit more of an expense? Because not only do they have to pay for me to go on this trip, they have to pay for my caregiver to go on the trip as well, and for their travel expenses, their food, things of that nature. And then today, I do the motivational speaking, like I said. I'm also an uncle of 4. I have 2 nieces and nephews. They're in the picture here on the right. They're the best. Love them dearly. And being an uncle has been amazing. They keep me young, so to speak. And it's luckily they've understood very early on that Uncle Kev just has to deal with things a little bit differently and might need a little more help with certain things. Sometimes they'll grab some snacks and they'll come up to me and be like, "Do you want one?" I'll be like, "Yeah, sure." And they understand that if they want me to eat something, they have to put it in my mouth themselves. So they're amazing. I love them dearly. And yeah, so that's what life is like as an uncle. So at this point in the presentation, you're probably wondering a very simple question. How does this apply to me, right? Maybe, you don't have a disability. I don't see any other wheelchairs in this room. So you're wondering, why am I listening to this guy? And just when you think that something doesn't apply to you, I want you to make sure you understand that it actually does apply to you. Fun fact, I've actually been here before, not for a speech, but a friend of mine directs plays for the Deerfield Family Theater. His name is Matt Cannon. I believe some of you might know him, potentially. So I've been here before for different performances. And the last time I came here was over a decade ago. And this auditorium looks completely different than the last time I was here. As you can see by these photos, which were so gracefully sent to me by Mr. Clough, and I believe they were provided by the choir teacher. And one thing I do want to point out is this quote here on the bottom, and mainly that last sentence, that the previous stage was having some problems, the wood was warping, and it wasn't safe at all for anyone, wheelchair or not. So when you think that something is being done to improve accessibility, I just want you to keep in mind that yes, I benefit from it too because I use a wheelchair, but you all also benefit from it as well. As you can see, sitting in this beautiful theater here today in what I would say are much nicer chairs than those folding chairs. So it worked out. And a few takeaways that I would like you all to take away from this presentation here is to be the change. So encouraging others to be inclusive and to ask how you can best accommodate their needs is a great way of approaching it. Maybe you have classmates who have a disability and you want to include them in, going to a movie or hanging out at someone's house. The simple question of, hey, do you want to join us? And how can we make this easier for you? Goes such a long way. It just makes someone like me feel heard, feel understood, and it shows that you're trying, right? And maybe it won't be possible. Maybe sometimes it won't work out, and that's okay. But at least you made the effort. And I also encourage you to keep making the effort. If it doesn't work out the first time, try again. Be like, hey, I know you were busy that day. We're doing something on this day. You want to hang out with us? That goes such a long way for people with disabilities. Avoid disableist language and encourage others to do so. I'm not going to say what those words are. I'm sure you probably already know. If it sounds like it would be hateful towards someone with a disability, don't use it. And if you hear someone else using it, tell them not to. These words have an impact. It is not a fun feeling to be called one of these words. And believe me, I have many times throughout my life. So please do your best to be accepting and understanding of everyone's situation. And then last, advocate for better accessibility and for the rights of disabled people. I already mentioned this theater and how much more accessible it is. We wouldn't be having this speech in this theater if it wasn't renovated. For the simple fact that I wouldn't be able to get on this stage because that walkway over there to your right was not here. There was no way for me to get up here. And I have some examples of this as well in the real world. So this is a sidewalk that is actually near where I live in Palatine. And you can see here in the red circle that the sidewalk is crumbling in this area. And then you can see over time here, this was about a week later, they marked it for replacement, and then the following week, it was replaced. And how did I go about this? Well, I reached out to the village. I have the mayor's email and the public works director's email very handy because things come up all the time. Sometimes you notice something, it's like, hey, this could be better, this could be more accessible. So this is actually the reply I got from them. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the one thing I do want to point out is that they have 3 different programs for handling sidewalks. And while they were planning on replacing this stretch of sidewalk at a certain point, they managed to do it sooner because I brought it up to them, right? It was replaced within 2 weeks, where it may have taken another year if I hadn't said anything. So it does pay to say something, because more often than not, people are open to it and they'll see the problem. They'll understand like, oh yeah, you're right. This isn't accessible. We can do better on this. And then here's another example that I go to this Potbelly all the time. It's located in Killdeer. You'll see here, there is a curb cut here, but there's no curb cut here. So if I were to cross from one side to the other, what would I do? The answer is that I would have to go into the street, which is a little more visible on this screenshot. And you can see this screenshot was taken 7 years after the original one. And now there are curb cuts on both sides. And the other curb cut was installed because I reached out to the owner of the shopping center and I pointed it out to them. And I said, hey, this isn't accessible for everyone. A wheelchair cannot cross from one side to the other without going in the street. And that creates an unnecessary safety hazard. And then finally, I just want to end it on this. This right here is what a typical week of my life looks like. This is the schedule for my caregivers. Every one of these shifts has to be covered every single week without fail. There is no room for failure. If someone doesn't show up, that's a big problem. If someone doesn't show up in the mornings, I'm stuck in bed. If someone doesn't show up at lunch, I'm not eating lunch or using the bathroom. And if someone doesn't show up at night, I'm not eating dinner, using the bathroom, or going to bed. Those are all things that just simply cannot happen. So this is what my life is like. And I can assure you, it is a full-time job managing this. You're managing people's schedules, availabilities, other things that are just going on in their life. And it is a full-time job that I don't get paid for. It's just something that I have to do. So that's something that I want you to all keep in mind as you leave here today, that people who have different circumstances, such as myself, are often dealing with many other things that most of us could not imagine ever dealing with.